Hi, it's Ms. Dubas here. Welcome to the 7th lesson of the Climatic Hazards Unit, and this lesson is all about Typhoon Haiyan. Please make sure that you've got a pen, a piece of paper, and that you've got a different colour pen to mark with, and that you're working somewhere quiet and free of distraction so that you can focus on your learning. And whenever you're ready, we can get started. So the focus of our lesson today is on Typhoon Haiyan 2013, a tropical storm example. So Typhoon Haiyan was a Category 5 storm which significantly affected the Philippines. And this lesson, we're going to be finding out all about the effects of and the responses to this particular named example of a tropical storm. So let's consider the location of the Philippines and find out a little bit more about this country. Make sure you take care over the spelling of Philippines throughout the lesson. So let's first consider the location of the Philippines on a global scale. So the Philippines is located on the continent of Asia, or Southeast Asia to be specific, in the Northern Hemisphere because it's north of the equator, and also in the Eastern Hemisphere. The Philippines is located between the equator and the Tropic of Cancer. And the Philippines is actually located in an area of the world where the conditions for tropical storm formation is really suitable. So tropical storms will form in the east and they will travel westwards towards the Philippines. So the Philippines itself is actually made up of over 7,000 islands, which make up what we call an archipelago, which is an extensive group of islands, and you can see this on the satellite image. The capital city of the Philippines is Manila, and that is identified on the satellite image. The other city that we're going to mention in today's lesson is the city of Tacloban, and that is located to the east of the country, identified on the satellite image. So the population of the Philippines is approximately 106 million people, and the population density on average is 340 people per square kilometre. However, there is an area that is more densely populated where there is a higher concentration of population, and that is in the north of the country, in and around Manila, as identified by the black circle on the screen. You'll also see an image of Manila just to the right of the screen. So within the Philippines, the male life expectancy is approximately 66 years, and the female life expectancy is approximately 73 years. The GNI per capita is approximately $3,160. And the other thing to note about the Philippines is that it's a multi-hazardous environment. So not only do they have to manage tropical storms, which are called typhoons in this area, but they also have to manage earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. One of the most famous volcanic eruptions to take place in the Philippines was in 1991, and that was when Mount Pinatubo erupted, and you can see this eruption in the image on the screen. So we're just going to check that you've understood those facts and figures before we move forward. So we're going to review some of these facts that you see on the screen, and I would like you to decide if you think these statements are true or false. So the Philippines is located on the African continent. That's number one. Number two, the Philippines is located south of the equator. Number three, the Philippines has a population of 250 million people. Number four, the Philippines has a GNI per capita of $3,160. And number five, the Philippines is a multi-hazardous environment. So are these statements true or false? So what I would like you to do is to pause the video to complete this task. I'd like you to write out each statement and write next to it if you think the statement is true or false. If you think something's false, please make the correction. And when you're ready, you can resume the video and we can mark your work. So we're now ready to mark your work. So please make sure that you're using a different colour pen to do this. If you've got it correct, give yourself a tick. And if you need to make any corrections in your different colour pen, that is absolutely fine. So let's check our answers. So number one, the Philippines is located on the African continent is false. It's actually Asia, or Southeast Asia to be specific. The Philippines, for number two, is located south of the equator. That's also false. It's actually located north of the equator. Number three, the Philippines has a population of 250 million people. That's false. It's approximately 106 million people. Number four, the Philippines has a GNI per capita of $3,160. That's true. And number five, the Philippines is a multi-hazardous environment. That is also true. So give yourself a score out of 5. So we're now going to review the path or the track of Typhoon Haiyan as it approached the Philippines, made landfall in the Philippines, and then moved beyond the Philippines. It's a bit like describing the route that Typhoon Haiyan took. So we're going to learn about how to describe the path taken by a tropical storm, and in this case, Typhoon Haiyan. So in order to describe the path taken by Typhoon Haiyan, we need to study the map on the screen. It shows the path taken by the typhoon as shown by the red dotted line. So Typhoon Haiyan approached the Philippines from the east, it made landfall, and then it continued to travel towards the country of Vietnam. So my description there was actually quite vague and not very detailed, and so we're going to learn about how to write about this in far more depth. So being able to describe the route taken by a tropical storm is actually a geographical skill. We have to tell the story. We have to imagine that somebody else cannot see the map that we can see, and we have to paint the picture to them. So what should be included in an answer that describes the path of Typhoon Haiyan in depth? So we will need to mention the general direction of travel, and there is a north arrow on your map to help you with that. We'll also need to make sure we mention any changes in direction of travel. So does it always travel in the same direction, or does it suddenly change? And if it does, where does that happen? We'll also need to consider the countries affected, and they are all labelled on the map. We also need to include in our answer the names of oceans and seas, which again are labelled on the map. And lastly, we also need to consider adding distance to our answer as well. And in the bottom left-hand corner of the map, you'll notice there is a scale bar to help you do this. So if you are going to be describing the path of any tropical storm, but in this case Typhoon Haiyan, those are the 5 things you should be including within your answer. There is something else on the map that is included, however, we shouldn't write about it in our answer, but it is interesting to see. So what do you notice about the strength of the typhoon? So as the tropical storm, so as Typhoon Haiyan approaches the Philippines, and you'll see the little diagram of the typhoon on the map itself, you'll see it's got a number 3 next to it, which means it's a category 3 storm. As it reaches the Philippines and makes landfall, it's a category 5 storm, and then you'll notice that the strength decreases to a 4, to a 3, to a 2, and then to a 1. So whilst that's really interesting, we shouldn't be including the strength of the typhoon in this situation within our answer if we're writing about the path taken by the tropical storm. So let's now have a go at completing this task. Describe the path of Typhoon Haiyan, 4 marks. We're going to make sure that we're going to use the advice we've just been talking about to ensure that our answer is really thorough and really detailed. So make sure that your answer includes general direction of travel, changes in direction of travel, countries affected, oceans and seas, and distance. So please complete the activity by pausing the video now and then resuming the video when you're ready to mark your work. So we're now ready to mark our work. So please make sure that you've got a different colour pen so that you're able to do this effectively. You'll notice that I've colour coded in my answer anywhere where I've met the success criteria so you can see it really clearly. So Typhoon Haiyan approaches from the Pacific Ocean in the east, travelling west as it makes landfall in the Philippines. The typhoon continues to travel west across the South China Sea for over 1,000 kilometres before making landfall in Vietnam. The storm travels northwest before changing direction quite dramatically as it reaches northern Vietnam. It begins to travel northeast towards China. So at this stage, you may want to pause the video and redraft your own answer to ensure you've included all of the key points. If not, that is absolutely fine and we're ready to move on. So we're now going to consider the characteristics and hazards of Typhoon Haiyan. So what was it like and what made it so dangerous? So Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines refers to when the typhoon itself actually made landfall in the Philippines, and that was on the 8th of November in 2013. And it was a category 5 storm as it made landfall. So in some areas, there were over 280 millimetres of rainfall, and they were in the worst affected areas. There were wind speeds of over 195 miles per hour. There was also a storm surge that took place in the Philippines as well, which combined with the high tide to create waves of over 5 metres in height. So not only was this area dealing with high wind speeds and high amounts of rainfall, it also had a storm surge to contend with as well. 90% of Tacloban, the city mentioned earlier in the lesson, was destroyed. You can see a satellite image here of Typhoon Haiyan, and you can see the eye of the storm right in the centre. So let's now consider the primary and secondary effects of Typhoon Haiyan. So we need to remind ourselves first of all about what we mean by a primary effect and a secondary effect, and then we need to look at the effects of Typhoon Haiyan and categorise them into each of these categories. So what is the difference between a primary and a secondary effect of a tropical storm or any other natural hazard? So a primary effect means the initial impacts of a natural event caused directly by it. In contrast to this, a secondary effect means the indirect impacts of a natural event occurring in the hours, weeks, months and years after the event. So let's look at an example of this. So an example of a primary effect would be homes damaged by strong storm winds. So the homes have been directly damaged, directly affected by the strong storm winds of a tropical storm. This could lead to a secondary effect. So the insurance payouts to cover the house repair costs is actually an indirect effect of the storm. So the primary effect was the actual house being damaged by the storm itself, and this led to insurance payouts to cover the house repairs, and this would be a secondary effect. So before we go on to look at the specific primary and secondary effects of Typhoon Haiyan, I'm going to be giving you in just a moment 5 seconds to think about how this typhoon may have affected people and the environment within the Philippines. So your 5 seconds will start in just a moment. I just want you to think about it, and then we're going to review some of the specific primary and secondary effects after. So your 5 seconds starts now. Okay, so let's now go on to think about some of the specific primary and secondary effects of Typhoon Haiyan. So I'm going to be giving you a list of 12 effects that will come up on the screen one by one in just a moment. What I would like you to do is to decide whether you think the effect that you're reading and that I am saying is either a primary or a secondary effect. So which category would you put it into? Now, what I would like you to do is to write number 1 and then primary or secondary next to it, number 2, primary or secondary. However, if you would prefer to wait until I've read out all 12 effects, then pause the video so you can write the actual effect and categorise it, that is also absolutely fine. So let's start. So the first effect is this. Typhoon Haiyan caused approximately 8,000 deaths. Is that primary or secondary? Number 2. Blocked roads caused by landslides. Primary or secondary effect? Number 3. 5.6 million jobs lost. Primary or secondary? Number 4. 1 million homes destroyed or damaged. Primary or secondary? Number 5. Outbreak of dysentery. Primary or secondary? Dysentery is a tummy upset. Number 6. Water contaminated by seawater. Primary or secondary? Number 7. Looting. This is where people will take or steal items that don't belong to them. Number 8. Rice prices rose by 11.9%. Primary or secondary? Number 9. 600,000 hectares of farmland flooded. Primary or secondary? Number 10. $13 million worth of damage. Primary or secondary? Number 11. Airport damaged. Primary or secondary? And lastly, number 12. 1.1 million tonnes of crops destroyed. Primary or secondary? So if you would like some more time to make your decisions, please pause the video at this point and then resume the video when you are ready to get started. So we're now ready to mark our work. So please make sure you've got a different colour pen. If you've got it correct, give yourself a tick. And if you've made a mistake or you need to make a correction, that is absolutely fine. You can use your different colour pen to do that. So remember that a primary effect is caused directly by Typhoon Haiyan and a secondary effect is caused indirectly by Typhoon Haiyan. So number 1, approximately 8,000 deaths, primary effect. Number 2, blocked roads caused by landslides, secondary effect. Number 3, 5.6 million jobs lost, secondary effect. Number 4, 1 million homes destroyed or damaged, primary effect. Number 5, outbreak of dysentery, secondary effect. Number 6, water contaminated by seawater, primary effect. Number 7, looting, secondary effect. Number 8, rice prices rose by 11.9%, secondary effect. Number 9, 600,000 hectares of farmland flooded, primary effect. Number 10, $13 million worth of damage, primary effect. 11, airports damaged, primary effect. And number 12, 1.1 million tonnes of crops destroyed is a primary effect. So give yourself a score out of 12. So we're now going to review the effects of Typhoon Haiyan in a different way. So you'll see on the screen that we have the list of effects that we've just grouped into primary and secondary effects. What we're going to do now is to challenge ourselves by recategorising these effects into 3 new categories. So social effects are impacts on lives of people. Economic effects are impacts on the wealth of the area, and environmental effects are impacts on the landscape and ecology, including the water of an area. So what I would like you to do is I'd like you to pause the video and see if you can group these effects here into those 3 different categories. Now, some of these particular effects may actually fall into more than one of the categories, and that is absolutely fine. So please pause the video, have a go at categorising the effects, and then resume the video when you are ready to mark your work. So we're now ready to mark our work. So please make sure you're using a different colour pen. Give yourself a great big tick if you've got it correct, and make sure you make any corrections with your different colour pen if you need to. So remember that these effects may fall into more than one category. So approximately 8,000 deaths is social. Blocked roads caused by landslides is actually social, economic and environmental. It prevents people accessing where they need to go. It also prevents businesses transporting their goods, and obviously it changes the landscape, which is environmental. 5.6 million jobs lost, economic. 1 million homes destroyed or damaged is social and economic. Outbreak of dysentery, social, because it makes people unwell. Water contaminated by seawater, environmental. Looting, social, because it increases the crime rate, but also economic, because it means that people may lose money on things that are taken away from the area that they've been removed from. Rice prices rose by 11.9%, economic. 600,000 hectares of farmland flooded, environmental, but also economic, because people will lose money from those crops that have been destroyed. $11 million worth of damage, economic. Airport damage, social and economic. It prevents people from accessing other places, and also it affects goods being able to be transported in and out of the country through exports and imports. And lastly, 1.1 million tonnes of crops destroyed. So this is environmental, but it's also economic. So how did you get on? So to consolidate our understanding of the effects of Typhoon Haiyan, we're going to have a go at this question. So using an example you've studied, explain the effects of a tropical storm, 6 marks. So let's think about what would need to be included in our answer. The example you've studied is Typhoon Haiyan. To explain an effect means that you must say how the tropical storm has led to the effect, and there may be a chain of events that have happened. And you must use specific facts and figures in your answer from the case study. So you might structure one of your paragraphs like this. So Typhoon Haiyan created maybe storm surges, high wind speeds, rainfall, this caused, this led to. So that would be a really good way to structure one of your paragraphs, and that would get you 3 marks. So if you did that twice, that would get you 6 marks. So I want you to think about what Typhoon Haiyan actually created, what problems did it cause, and what knock-on effects did that have for the people that lived in these areas. So I'd like you to pause the video now. I would like you to have a go at answering your question, and then I would like you to resume the video when you are ready to mark your work. So we're now ready to mark our work, so please make sure you have a different colour pen in order to do this. So what you'll notice about my answer is I've colour-coded it into different sections. So where I've named the example, so Typhoon Haiyan, that's in green. Anywhere where I've used case study facts and figures, that's in purple. And where I've developed my ideas and where I've extended my points, I've done that in the pink colour. So let's have a look at my marks. So Typhoon Haiyan created wind speeds of up to 195 miles an hour, 1 mark. This caused 1 million homes to be destroyed or damaged, 1 mark, leading to many people becoming homeless, 1 mark. The second paragraph then, the storm surge 5 metres and heavy rainfall 280 millimetres caused 600,000 hectares of farmland to be flooded, 1 mark. This meant 1.1 million tonnes of crops were destroyed, 1 mark, leading to an 11.9% increase in rice prices, 1 mark. So how did you get on? If you want to pause the video at this point to have a look at my model answer in more detail and to redraft your own answers, that is absolutely fine. So now we know about some of the effects of Typhoon Haiyan, let's think about how Typhoon Haiyan was managed and dealt with. So what were the immediate and long-term responses to Typhoon Haiyan? So we need to know what we mean by an immediate response and a long-term response, and then be able to categorise the responses into each of these categories. So an immediate response is the reaction of people as a disaster happens and in the immediate aftermath. So for example, providing emergency food, water and medical supplies. Long-term responses though are slightly different. They are the reaction of people in the weeks, months and years after a disaster. So for example, creating buildings which can withstand tropical storm winds and heavy rain. So let's think about some of the responses to Typhoon Haiyan that took place in the Philippines. And what I'm going to ask you to do in just a moment is to pause the video to complete this task. So I would like you to copy and complete the table that you see on the screen and decide if the response that you're reading about is an immediate or a long-term response. So remember, immediate is that initial reaction. How is it dealt with straight away? And then longer term, maybe in the weeks, months and years after the event. So let's have a look at the different responses so that you can make your decision. So Pagasa broadcast warnings 2 days before, leading to over 750,000 people being evacuated. Pagasa stands for the Philippine Atmospheric, Geophysical and Astronomical Services Administration. The UN raised $300 million for relief and rebuilding. Fishermen were warned not to go to work at sea. A state of emergency was declared and aid was sent. A no-build zone was put in place in the areas most affected. And tourism was encouraged. The income was spent on rebuilding. So please pause the video. Decide if you think the statements are referring to immediate or long-term responses, and when you're ready to mark your work, please resume the video. So let's mark our work. Make sure that you have used a different colour pen in order to do that. So let's take each response and decide if it is immediate or long term. So Pagasa broadcasts warnings 2 days before, leading to over 750,000 people being evacuated. That was an immediate response and saved a lot of lives. Obviously, people were being moved away from areas at risk to areas of safety. The UN raised $300 million for relief and rebuilding. That is long term. And the aim of rebuilding is to try and build back better and to make sure that the buildings are perhaps stronger and more able to withstand tropical storms in the future. Fishermen were warned not to go to sea, an immediate response. A state of emergency was declared and aid was sent, immediate. So aid, for example, shelters, medical supplies, water and food supplies were sent from other countries to help and support the Philippines. A no-build zone was put in place in the areas most affected, long term, and tourism was encouraged. The income was spent on rebuilding. That was also long term. So we're now going to finish on one last task to complete our understanding of Typhoon Haiyan and the responses that took place as a result of the typhoon in 2013. So I'd like you to have a go at this final question. Explain how immediate and long-term responses can reduce the effects of a tropical storm. Use an example you have studied. 6 marks. So let's think about what we might need to include in our answer. You must use facts and figures from the Typhoon Haiyan case study because the question asks you to use an example you've studied. I would refer to one immediate response and one long-term response to be able to gain your mark, so you can get 3 marks for each. You must fully develop each of your ideas to be clear about how the response reduces the effects. So how does the response reduce deaths and damage within the context of a tropical storm? So the 2 that I have selected are just on the screen below. So an immediate response, I'm going to talk about evacuation in my answer, and my long-term response, I'm going to talk about no-build zones in my answer. So I'm going to explain what they are and how they actually reduce the effects of Typhoon Haiyan and tropical storms generally. So I'd like you to pause the video for you to have a go at that activity now and then resume when you are ready to mark your work, and then I will show you my model answer that covers these 2 types of responses. So we're now ready to mark our work. So just as before, I have colour-coded certain points within my answer to show how I've done these 3 things. So the named example, Typhoon Haiyan, is in green. Any specific facts or figures are in purple, and where I have developed my ideas more than once, you'll see those in pink, and that shows how I've gained my marks. So let's have a look at the answer. One immediate response to Typhoon Haiyan was the evacuation of 750,000 people 2 days before the typhoon made landfall. 1 mark. Evacuation to higher ground ensures that people have time to leave areas at risk of storm surges. 1 mark, which reduces the overall death rate. 1 mark. So I've extended my point twice. One long-term response to Typhoon Haiyan involved creating no-build zones in the areas most affected by Typhoon Haiyan. 1 mark. This means that, during future events, buildings and infrastructure will not be damaged. 1 mark. Which reduces the cost of the damage and the number of lives lost. 1 mark. So I've developed each of those ideas. If you would like to pause this video now so you can use this model answer to redraft your answer, that is absolutely fine. But if you've included all of these points, very, very well done. So that brings us to the end of our lesson about Typhoon Haiyan today. There has been a lot of information and a lot of activities within this lesson just to help you understand the case study in detail. Please now complete the exit quiz to ensure that you've understood all the key points from today, and it might be a really good idea to summarise the 3 main things that you've learnt from completing the lesson. Thank you for joining me for this lesson. Take care and look forward to seeing you soon.